In 2024, the EU public will elect a new European Parliament, which will play a crucial role in choosing the new European Commission leaders and setting the policy priorities for the coming 5 years, including migration, which is perceived increasingly among the top priorities for policymakers in Brussels. Therefore, this is a crucial moment for understanding the evolving landscape of migration policy and the impact on future political directions. My name is Paulina Godinez. I am a communication officer at ICMPD. And in this episode of the Migration Podcast by ICMPD, we will take a deep dive into the past 5 years of migration in the European Union and analyzing how this can influence the upcoming EU elections and shape the agenda for the new leaders of the European Commission. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming two experts in this topic. So my first guest is Hugo Brady, who is a senior strategic advisor at ICMPD. Thank you for being with us, Hugo.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
And my second guest for today's episode is Martin Wagner, who is senior policy advisor at ICMPD. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
So to start with, as we look at the broader landscape of EU migration policy over the past 5 years, it's clear that significant geopolitical shifts globally and internal demands within the EU have shaped its course. To mention some, for instance, the COVID-19 pandemic created some very unique challenges. And the von der Leyen Commission has indeed made significant reforms in responses to these pressures, but some key challenges still remain. Hugo, could you elaborate a bit more on these reforms and how these reflect the EU's response to these global and internal pressures?
Thanks, Paulina. I'd love to. First, it's necessary to go back, in fact, almost 10 years to 2015, when the EU experienced its first true migration crisis. Now, there had been other incidences that caused a lot of concern for governments, but this was the first one that was truly experienced by the EU almost as a whole. In the media every day, there were regular reports saying this crisis will tear Europe apart. The fundamental question when the almost 1.2 million Syrians came to the EU's external border, mostly via Turkey, should the EU's borders be a welcoming or unwelcoming place for people seeking asylum? And this threw open this big political question, which subsequently divided the member states of Europe. Also, we had Brexit in 2016, and immigration was largely an anxiety shared by UK voters that caused them to vote to leave the European Union. The European Union actually lost one of its biggest member states, largely over the issue of immigration. And for the next couple of years, member states in the EU governments continued to argue over this issue, and there was no resolution. They actually, in the end, just gave up, exhausted. There was an attempt to reform the EU's asylum laws. It didn't work. And there was an attempt to restore the unity of the now 27 countries over the migration issue, but there was very little consensus. So they basically arrived into 2020 exhausted and divided. It was a very unfortunate reprieve because it was the breakout of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, before that, the argument was over how open should our borders be. When COVID-19 came, it changed the whole conversation to actually sometimes you have to close borders. If it's a matter of public safety, in this case, public health, COVID-19 came along and everybody closed borders. We even closed air borders. The same year, the migration issue began to come back a little bit when one of Europe's largest refugee camps, Moria camp on the island of Lesbos in Greece, burned to the ground. This was a very graphic symbol that the EU was still, even though this issue had gone to sleep, it had not gone away, and the EU was still failing adequately to manage it. The next year, we had the tragedy of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, which led a lot of people to believe there would be a renewed wave of uncontrolled migration to Europe. And also, for the very first time, the realization that sometimes migratory flows are directed towards the European Union deliberately. And this is what happened when Alexander Lukashenko, the autocratic ruler of Belarus, deliberately channeled irregular migrants, as he had been threatening to do for many years, towards the EU in order to gain some political concessions from the EU. Then the next year, in 2022, we had a crisis on the other side of the spectrum with the outbreak of the Ukraine war in February 2022. And suddenly Europe opened its borders and 5 million Ukrainians crossed into the EU practically overnight and were given access to the EU in various countries. First of all, they could go to any country they wanted. This is an absolute first in the history of the EU. Second of all, they were given free access to Europe's social systems, labour markets and education and health services. That has never happened before in the history of the EU. After COVID, there was a lot of pent-up desire for mobility and movement around the EU, and we could see a sharp rise in the Western Balkans. More and more people were coming. And finally, in 2023, there was more or less a full-blown crisis where figures went back to their 2016 levels. So in that year, we had 270,000 people arrive irregularly in the Mediterranean, and this was almost the same as the first great crisis in 2015, 2016. And that's how we have arrived here to 2024, and already 60,000 people have come. So we are still, migration is top of the political agenda because figures are still very high, especially in the Mediterranean.
Thank you, Hugo, for highlighting these key events in the last 5 years and bringing the figures and the impact of it. How would you compare the current commission to the previous one in terms of what they were dealing with and how they responded to it?
I think that for me, this period we're talking about was one in which many taboos were broken in migration policy that would not have been conscionable in the previous commission. First of all, if you said under the previous commission that foreign rulers weaponize irregular migration flows in order to lean on European governments to get what they wanted, you would have been considered a populist or an extremist or a controversialist. Today, it's accepted that happens because Alexander Lukashenko was so blatant in what he did. So therefore, the EU has actually already changed its laws to accept this reality. Secondly, the idea that Europe would let in 5 million people overnight and give them automatic access to its labour markets and social systems was completely taboo 5 years ago. It was all based on a law, which Martin knows much better than me, that was agreed in the early 2000s, almost forgotten byproduct of the Balkan Wars and never used since. So governments dusted down this almost taboo piece of regulation and triggered it. Also, during that time, and this is something I didn't get to mention in the build-up, is that aside from this new turn towards control and consciousness of weaponization and other matters, there's also been a great demand since the COVID pandemic for foreign labour. Europe's 6 biggest economies have more or less announced that they need to attract millions of workers by 2030. No politician in history has ever gotten up on a box at election time and said, if you elect me, I guarantee millions more migrants by 2030. Yet, in fact, that is more or less government policy for Europe's 6 biggest economies. Now, foreign workers, of course, and we'll get to this later in the discussion, are not the same as asylum seekers at all. And there's a growing public awareness of that fact. Last point is if you 5 years ago said we should process some asylum claims outside of Europe in order to discourage dangerous journeys across the sea, and in order to make sure that only people who really need international protection come to Europe using the asylum rules. That was also a controversial idea. People would say, oh, we're not Australia, which uses a similar system. So does the US. But Europe, to have that as a discussion 5 years ago was impossible. Just last week, 15 European countries wrote to the European Commission saying, we want this to be trialled in the next lifetime of the next Commission, 5 years from now. We want to go down this road. We want to find a European model for external or remote processing, call it what you want. And lastly, this Commission embraced control of irregular migration the way the previous Commission never did. In September 2020, they proposed the so-called Pact on Asylum and Migration. And okay, we're going to get into the many different parts of the Pact during this talk, but fundamentally, the Pact is about stopping the Mediterranean boat crisis through accelerated procedures and very quick return of the people who come. In the previous Commission, the emphasis was about if desperate people arrive in a boat to Europe's shores, all there is to discuss is we have to find a way to share them out amongst us fairly, and we have to look after them. It would not have been conscionable to say we must do accelerated procedures and return these people as quickly as possible, because 20% of the people coming on the central Mediterranean do not qualify for asylum. So this realisation has made the Commission, and perhaps politics as well, has made the Commission switch more towards controlling the situation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're going to come back to some of the points that you just mentioned now. And I think connected to the question that I directed to Hugo and Martin, Looking back, how do you see as the most significant achievements of the current Commission?
Hugo already outlined quite a lot what happened in this last legislative tenure, actually, the last 5 years. One actually, just if you think one more time what Hugo told us now, COVID, just right from the beginning as a start, we were not actually from the previous Commission, we did not overcome, we were still somehow in a crisis mode after 2015-16, and then a new commission comes, a new wind could start, new options, new opportunities could start, and then immediately started COVID, which basically broke down everything. Hugo basically said it broke down the mobility as we know it, which of course impacts on migration. But then very shortly afterwards, we had Moria was mentioned, the fire in Moria, that also showed something in the European system on migration does not really work too properly if you have people concentrated on one island in this case. And then we had the shipwreck Adriana, if you remember that, it was just 1 year ago, where 750 people were on a boat. Many of them disappeared, most likely most of them died. So there were a lot of these things happening, and Ukraine, we will come to that a bit later. So in one way or the other, one must really put some credit to the Commission right now that they still managed to pull out of this pact that you already spoke about. And to find here agreement over such diverse things is in the middle of one crisis following the other, I find quite remarkable. And on top of this, and it was already mentioned, happened Ukraine, or the unprovoked invasion of Russia to Ukraine. Also Hugo already mentioned, this came on top of the regular arrivals of people, of irregular arrivals, asylum arrivals, legal arrivals, all kind of things. And on top of that, we have also more than, actually that people came were more than 5 million, now staying more or less 4 million people under temporary protection in the EU. So enormous amount of different types of challenges. And I don't speak about many that are actually outside of the EU.
Well, I think the short answer to Polina's question is this Commission managed to get the legislation passed on asylum reform, and the previous one didn't.
And then I think now we have like a good overview of what happened and the main key events. Martin, how has ICMPD responded to these events through policies, research, or their work in general?
ICMPD's work is accompanying or closely monitoring what happens not only in Europe but also around Europe. We have several kind of outlets with what we try to capture the policy part of developments that we also see. What does a situation like Ukraine, a situation like instrumentalization mean actually for policymakers? We have at each beginning of the year, we have a migration outlook where we already look to the future. What will be the next year for us? We will come back to something that we have since the last commission that came in, something which recommendations for the incoming EU leadership. We'll come back to that to also define some policy priorities for the incoming leadership. And of course, if there's something happening like Ukraine, where especially our ICMPD member states are also so closely impacted by that, for example, Poland, the frontline countries are more or less ICMPD member states, then we of course also looked very closely into this, and together with member states, but also experts from migration field, academics, civil society, we try to have roundtable discussions, or just to bring together the knowledge and experiences that were made in the different countries and try to find policy relevant solutions also. And particularly on Ukraine, probably we now or later will delve for sure a bit more into it, where we in ICMPD did quite a lot work on this, and quite early on to already look what happens actually afterwards when temporary protection will end.
Yeah. I think now that you already mentioned the topic, it would be interesting if you could give us a bit of context on the Temporary Protection Directive, and what it was so special now in this 5 years of the Commission.
Usually you have arrivals of asylum seekers in smaller numbers, but once when national asylum systems are so overburdened also because so many people come at once. Then the EU very long ago, and actually Hugo already alluded to that, looked back at what happened in Bosnia, and one of the first EU legal acts that were adopted was actually the Temporary Protection Directive. This was adopted in 2001. Since then, never used. Then there was 2015-16. There was some discussion about using it again, but the member states were very reluctant, also because it was a bit a different situation. But now with Ukraine, it's very clear. Neighboring country of the EU, people only had the possibility to either go to Russia, the perpetrator of the whole situation, and on the other side, the EU. And most of them chose to come to the EU, and this, of course, would not have been solved with regular asylum procedures that took very long. So the EU triggered the Temporary Protection Directive, and this was on very, very quickly, within 1 week after the invasion, which is incredibly remarkable. And I think this was also the point that Hugo made before. It's 27 countries very quickly come together and agree that we have to trigger it. And with triggering, it is a mechanism that it provides protection, first for 1 year, it can be prolonged for another year, and then it can prolonged for another year. And that's the reason why it is now so important, because these 3 years will end basically when the new EU leadership will start. And this will be in March 2025. So I think one of the things that the new EU leadership will need to very quickly think of what to do with 4 million people who stay in Europe.
I mean, if I can just make a quick comment on that, Paulina, imagine the United States opened its borders and took in 5 million Venezuelans overnight and gave them all automatic status, free accommodation in most cases, and full access to social services, the healthcare system, and their labour markets. I mean, if the US did that, we would all be sitting here talking about the rebirth of American soft power. But I don't think anyone outside Europe gives Europe any credit for all they say is the Europeans are hypocritical because they don't do that for other. They didn't do that in the Syrian situation, for example, etc., etc. But it really is quite a remarkable development. The admission of so many people in such a short space of time, consensually. Remember, inside the EU, there's almost never consensus on migration, but in this case, everyone agreed, everyone. So it truly was a remarkable situation.
And now I think we also talked about like 2025 is approaching. So if you could elaborate a bit more on what's the role of ICMPD in either advancing the Temporary Protection Directive, or if there's already any talk already with partners or different stakeholders on how to continue the situation.
We will come still on something that we will come up with a proposal for the new EU leadership. One point there will be, because it will be, as I mentioned just before, one of the first points to solve what will happen with temporary protection after March 2025. We also saw that there are many tensions there. And I just give 2 examples. We have one tension that Ukraine wants their people back very clearly. Ukraine needs their population back. And currently many cannot return because either they come from regions and the situation is completely volatile and unpredictable. So return in the usual sense where we talk is not really an issue at the moment. But on the other side, what would be the possibility after temporary protection is that you move into the national system, yeah? And then it is who should come first in, and those who first come in easier are mostly those who have a job, who can easily change from the temporary protection into a job, a residence permit, for example. But those are most likely exactly the ones that Ukraine also would like to have back. So there is some kind of diplomatic kind of dilemmas that you have with whatever solution you propose for afterwards. Yeah. But I think for ICMPD, we are at the moment, we are discussing it. It's not yet completely clear. And EU leadership, the Commission, the now Commission, decided to not do anything anymore on that. So it will be the task for the next one to say whether we can prolong it. It's a legal question also, whether you really can prolong it. But it seems at the moment that there's some consensus. We need at least 1 more year to think. But we said already back in late 2022, we already said this point will come when we need to do something for afterwards. So I think we need some plan to fade out of temporary protection for the sole reason because temporary protection is not really good for the people, but also not good for example, employers in Austria. They need also some guarantees that people stay, or educational institutes who invests in someone when you know the person might not stay another year. Yeah, he cannot finish it. So there are many possibilities that you can think of, and one of them actually was also a bit what Hugo said before, with kind of the possibility to move, so circularity. If you say that people should go back, but they have the chance to come again to EU countries, not only for the visa-free regime, what they're allowed to for 3 months, but also to work or something, because this then also helps that it's not a once in a lifetime opportunity or something to stay here. Yeah, so this is also the dilemma that you very often find in migration. If you say either or, then people will rather remain and not choose to go back, for example.
And don't forget, the security situation inside Ukraine is getting really worse every week now. And a very severe Russian offensive is expected this summer, is building around Kharkiv. So we can't exclude that there will be another wave of another outflow from Ukraine, which, although I think there is still a large amount of consensus amongst the European public that Ukrainians need to be protected, need to be sheltered while their country is under attack. Still, it has now been over 2 years. And there is a limit to what the public can sort of accept. And that's one reason why it seemed last year that every country in Europe, from a relatively quiet couple of years, suddenly seemed to have a migration crisis, because you had a large Ukrainian cohort, but also a large increase since the pandemic of asylum seekers to Europe, also to America, Canada. Actually, what's happening is an unprecedented migration from the developing to the developed world. So this came at the same time as the Ukrainian conflict. And both of those things together have made, well, migration one of the top issues in the forthcoming European elections in a few days.
Yes, and I think for sure this is going to be a topic of interest. So hopefully we're going to have the space to discuss it on another podcast also here.
Well, no promises. Don't do this live now. Try and tie me into doing another one.
And I think I would be happy if we could go back to one of the key elements or key points in the past 5 years. So the new EU Migration and Asylum Pact, which for sure had some very comprehensive reforms. And I think there is like a significant anticipation if this is going to be an effective tool to manage effectively migration. So Martin, again, how confident are you that the Pact can truly transform the EU's approach to migration?
Speaking about confidence on this issue is quite a good one. Probably I would like to give one step back, because Pact on Asylum and Migration, I think it's not really clear what this is, what a pact is or something like this. Just also for listeners to understand a bit, the pact is basically consists of a number of 10 legal acts that were negotiated since 2015-16. Hugo already said this was actually many of these files already started under the previous commission and were went over to these ones. So basically, these files were discussed over the last 8 to 9 years. The common European asylum system is a bit opened, where there are also broad issues of return into the asylum system to make things apparently, or that's the idea of it, to make them more efficient. Yeah, so it's a huge thing. It's not only the legal part of it, but also with explanations before. But my point is a bit like this is the reason why such complex things come, because migration is so disputed and each member state wants to have this and this pieces in there. And I think this is not only my biggest concern, or I think that most who work on it wonder how this can be implemented, because this is what it is about. It is not about what is written on paper, but it will be important what will be implemented in practice.
Martin, I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I just to... The other day, I saw the Commission give a presentation on how they're going to start implementing this thousands and thousands of pages. There's around 10 legal acts at EU level then to be translated into European. Every country's national administration is going to have to somehow figure out how are we going to make this a reality. And even in Brussels, they have to come up with 21 so-called implementing acts, which are clarifications about how the various parts of the legislation are to be enacted by governments. When we say pact, what does a pact mean? It's an agreement between European countries how to manage irregular arrivals to the EU. That's what the pact is. And we already have a pact. It's called the Dublin regulation. And that, in one form or another, has been the original pact of how European governments were supposed to manage asylum claims together over the last 30 years. And why do they have to have such an agreement? Because they have something called the Schengen area of passport-free travel, which is a free circulation area, or should be. And in order to have such a thing, you must have rules on asylum seekers. Now, those rules basically collapsed in the 2015 crisis. And ever since then, as Martin says, for 10 years, in fact, we have been trying to find a new, more modern, more workable set of rules. But a paradox in this is, Martin pointed out that the Temporary Protection Directive, is quite simple. And that's one reason why we suspect it was such a success. In fact, it made governments reflect at the time, maybe the Commission has gotten too academic, too intellectual, and created too complicated rules. Because the more complex a rule is, the harder it is to implement. And I share Martin's concern 100%, that this Commission, I've been really impressed with its intellectual ability. And I've also been really impressed with its ability to listen and to try and find what it considered a fair compromise. One reason I thought that the Pact would work was when it came out in September 2020, you remember, Martin, both people from the open borders side, say, and people from the control migration now side, they both hated it. And that's, in my mind at the time, I said, this is going to work. Because that's a very good sign of a centrist piece of legislation, centrist proposal to manage, as Martin says, an extremely divisive issue. Everything you say on migration is wrong. Isn't that right, Martin? I think, whatever you say, there will always be someone who says, I disagree, I don't like it. And sometimes it's just a very noisy democratic conversation, and that should be welcomed. It shouldn't be avoided. But I share 100% the worry that all these implementing acts, all this very complicated procedures, they look good on paper, and the goals are, at least in my view, laudable and very necessary. But whether or not they be able to translate that into more or less a uniform European-wide approach. And remember, nothing like Schengen exists anywhere in the world either. I mean, where are you from, Paulina, can I ask?
Guatemala.
In Latin America, is there anything like the Schengen area?
No.
So nowhere else in the world is there anything. We often forget about this. It's a completely unique achievement. And in politics, they say people don't remember the bread that they ate yesterday. And I think that we take for granted the Schengen area. It's expanded, but since 2020, in the last crisis, there was a breakdown in trust between countries. So sometimes you go inside the EU, you will get asked for a passport check, especially on land routes. But since 2020, the number of countries requiring that has doubled. And what does that mean? It means despite all this great intellectual progress we've made, on the ground, there is still a continuing breakdown in the confidence in the collective governance of the Schengen area as regards irregular migration. In fact, I hope not too late to stop this steady erosion of confidence in what is a beautiful idea and one of the best things about the EU.
Just two more things on that. Interestingly enough, today is the day when the whole pact was published in the official journal, which means that now we have a date, and it will be 1st June 2026. It must be implemented. Yeah, so we have 2 years' time. So I think Hugo and I also before told already how complex the system will be, and now 2 years only. Member states have time to think how to do that, and there are so complex issues like what we did not speak at all about. I think for me, I see this very critical. The whole border procedure, because I mentioned before already, and it was mentioned in the introduction also, Moria, the hotspots approach that we had before, that people stay at the external borders in camps in order to see whether they go back or to the EU. This concept was already implemented under the previous commission, and one must say it failed, but not the idea failed, I think, but its implementation failed, because people arrived, but they could not get out of these camps. Neither they could return, because return was not possible is not possible to some of the countries, nor were they relocated by other EU countries. So they were stuck in Greece. And what we have now, I really hope that these border procedures, that the Pact has a lot of effort on the border procedures. It is the central piece in a way that people are screened at the borders, triage into asylum, more asylum possible claims, more return possible claims, and so on. And I really hope that the right lessons will be drawn from the hotspots approach.
What is the point of the Pact? And as Martin rightly said, there was a previous attempt at a similar idea. And the idea is basically people come to the European border spontaneously, not through an official legal channel. They don't have a visa. They get on a boat, perhaps in Tunisia or Libya, and they travel this way to the external border. And then the question for national and EU officials is, how do we determine the status of the person? Often, for example, people don't have identity documents and things like that. So the new Pact says people will, when they arrive, they must be screened. They must be screened for their basic health, security screening, and also a basic status check, i.e., is this person likely or more unlikely to be an asylum seeker? And what defines that? The EU has a set of laws. They're actually they're updated in this new legislation to how the asylum seeker should be received and how their status should be assessed. Now, in some parts of the external border, you have many Syrians arriving, for example, and Syrians have quite a high recognition rate in EU law. Most countries accept that Syria is a country still more or less in a civil conflict, and therefore it's dangerous to send people back there. On the central Mediterranean, most of those arriving are from West Africa or from South Asia. And generally speaking, these have a very low recognition rate amongst EU countries. So you have hundreds of thousands of people matching this description arriving in Italy. What do? First of all, you have to figure out where did they come from. Second of all, you have to figure out whether or not they should be given asylum or any form of asylum. The EU has a couple of different kinds. And then the new rules state you have to decide how many are going to stay in this country and be protected here, and how many are going to be shared out amongst the other EU countries through a process called relocation, and how many will have to be returned home. But then the problem is, in many cases, the migrants' home countries either will refuse to recognise that they are, yes, this is somebody from the Gambia, he is our citizen, we will take them back. That is an obligation under international law. It's not an unusual thing to ask. But it's a whole different story entirely to get that country to accept that a person without a passport who speaks their language is from their country. And then they have to be redocumented by that country's embassy in Italy, let's say, and then they have to agree themselves to go back. So it's a very long and complicated process. And actually ICMPD is active in helping governments with some aspects of that. Also the reintegration process, giving the person a fresh start in their home country if they have not qualified for asylum. So these are all the concepts behind the Pact. This is what the Pact is. But making it all happen, I'm afraid, is really challenging. I think it'll be really expensive. And there's another issue is, well, do you think that the person who's just stepped off a boat from Northern Africa is going to sit there for weeks, perhaps months, to have their status evaluated, potentially being handed a return order and being sent home? I think if most of us were in those boats, we would not hang around to be told to go home again. We would move on to, as many people do, for example, Germany, which still takes the majority of asylum seekers in the European Union. So this issue of how can people, and this is what happened with Moria, how do people stay? How can we ensure people stay where they are long enough to carry out the what we call, sorry for the jargon, accelerated procedure, which is just a fast decision on whether or not this person qualifies for asylum.
Thank you. Now I have a topic where I think I would be curious to have both your perspectives. So the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine I would say, were two of the less expected shocks to the system during the current commission. So given these circumstances, how do you see as the key strategic challenges and opportunities for the new commission in shaping this EU migration policy over the next term?
Well, Martin is pointing at me. I think the challenges will be, as Martin has pointed out, is actually when people say migration is such a huge issue in the European elections. So I think the first challenge facing the Commission and all of the governments will be how quickly they can bring these changes in, because they'll be under a lot of public pressure. We don't want to give the impression that migration is always and everywhere a controversial topic. In fact, some polling suggests it will not be as high on voters' lists of concerns as we have been led to believe. Let's see, we can come back and do another episode to discuss why migration wasn't such a big issue in the European elections after all. Nevertheless, to have a Schengen area, to have a free circulation area, we need a common set of asylum rules that work. So this is the first step, getting it done. And I think that there will be a lot of difficult questions were left, such as the detention issue, which is controversial, were left open in the legislation. And now in the implementation, governments will have to discuss, is this something that's going to be happening, on what scale, how for how long? So all of the many difficult issues will come up in the implementation process, which is almost another decision-making process itself. So there will be a lot of public pressure.
Yeah, and probably to complement a bit, I think what is certain, what we can be certain, there will be many uncertainties in the next commission. So I think all what actually Hugo told in his introduction before, none of this was on our agenda, or most of it was not on our agenda. So we see. Be prepared for the worst. Don't expect that it will be a calm floating boat in one way or the other. Migration is also a very comfortable topic for politicians. And for me, there are two things that I always see. The one thing, Brussels is blamed for everything that does not work, also at national level, to be very honest. And I think the expectations are very huge towards the Pact, for example. And this is for me one point I think the new incoming commission must handle also very well. Explain, and also to the public better than it was done before, because otherwise you will get more the blame of anything than the good work that is also done.
I think this is an absolutely key point, because neither the EU, sadly, I used to work there and I'm very, very pro-European, nor interior ministries are skillful communicators, especially on the migration is a multi-nuanced issue. It has so many different dimensions. It is, in fact, one of the hardest things to communicate. And everything you say is wrong to somebody. So trying to take a clear line, which is readily understandable, to the public will be very, very challenging. But what do the public want to hear? And this is also something that is not agreed upon. I said at the beginning, no politician in history has ever gotten up in a box at election time and said, if you elect me, I will bring more immigration to our country. Now, a question is that going to continue in the future? Because also for the very first time in human history, human population is slowly peaking and will begin to go downwards in the next few decades. For the very first time, you have European countries saying, we will attract millions of workers. We need to attract millions of workers. So you have this seeming paradox. We are toughening up the asylum laws under the Pact, but at the same time, we're opening up our labour markets to international labour. And so is everyone else in the world. So the question is, will this change the politics of migration? Will it change what people expect to hear from their politicians on migration? And as we at ICMPD believe migration is a very good thing, especially when managed correctly. It can be a very harmonious thing for society. And I'm so fascinated to see over the next couple of years how the conversation will it develop. Will it continue to develop in this rather negative trajectory where migration is something that must be controlled? Or will it actually be changed by fundamental changing forces around us? Or will one enable another? If the public believes that the government is in control, knows what it's doing, does that give political permission to open up channels wider, which are needed for our society and our economies?
Thank you. As we're discussing already topics looking into the future, so the new European Commission is set to take office soon, and changing landscape of the EU migration policy under different complex pressures and conflicts and certain shift in political dynamics, I would say there's a lot to consider in terms of the immediate priorities. So what do you both think should be some of the first items on the new Commission's agenda on migration?
I think Ukraine must be quite high on the files, simply because there is a deadline until March 25, so there must be something here. For me, I think immediately what we also spoke before, that only 2 years now time for implementation of the Pact. This will need a lot of concentration, and something that we did not yet speak much about, but I'm afraid that all the focus on the Pact will be quite deterred by, I think you mentioned it already, there was a letter by 15 EU member states that already now, before we even started to implement the Pact, asked the Commission to do more and beyond the Pact. And basically what we speak about, what is actually now on radio stations anyways, up and down, issues like externalization, the UK-Rwanda deal, Albania, Italy, there are different kind of concepts there, but they all go into the direction that asylum processing outside of the EU should be an option or should be done. But I also want to say I'm not the biggest fan of these kind of things, of this kind of ideas, but what I would really like to see in the future is to bring this discussion back to the center, not whenever you start with an idea that you're always bashed from one or the other side, but that you really discuss them, to come together and discuss them, because otherwise we will not move on. And you can be, something is not working too well with migration when people die. It cannot work like that. It cannot be our aim to have that. So something must change. And who already said before, one basic thing of the system is that people are here in the country, in the EU, in order to ask for asylum. So there must be other concepts also that people also can apply along the route or something like this. But these are things that the Commission will have on their agenda as soon as they are formed, and I think even before they will already have the files.
The lesson of the last 5 years is that basically policy is being driven by unexpected events. Ukraine, the pandemic, unprecedented global migration from east to west or from south to north. So there will be unexpected events, and the Pact won't be ready for until 2026. So there will be more policy innovation and probably some controversy. On the external processing idea, the idea of either processing people for asylum who want to claim asylum outside the EU, or as Italy is proposing to do, to actually bring people to another country, Albania. Italy and Albania have signed an agreement from, I think, November this year is the latest date that we've been given. They will try and do this with about 30,000 people a year in a bid to break the smuggling networks, that the promise of the smuggler to someone getting in a boat in North Africa to Europe. So all of these things are going to, and this letter stipulated a number of ideas that they want the Commission to try. It doesn't have to be antithetical to the Pact. It can be complementary to it. It doesn't have to be something that's necessarily bad. You can have ethical external processing. I think the head of the EU's asylum agency said that she is perfectly in favour of remote processing. Indeed, during the pandemic, a lot of remote processing of asylum claims happened because there was no other choice. So technology and procedures can make a lot of things possible that were not possible before, and to a great benefit, that people don't take incredibly dangerous journeys across the Mediterranean. The controversy is, what is the sanction? Does external processing mean no more territorial asylum in the EU? But under our laws, even under the EU's treaties, that's almost impossible, because all of those rights are enshrined at the heart of European law. So it would be nigh on impossible to deny completely the right to territorial asylum in the EU. So in this sense, I always say to people for whom this would be an extremely negative outcome, that it's very unlikely. But remote processing, I find that very likely. And also the US started doing something very similar over the last few years. And Europe likes to copy what the US does very often. So,
since we're already exploring the challenges and the strategies facing the new EU leadership in the coming years, I would like to bring our attention to ICMPD's REX initiative. So Martin, if you could maybe explain to our listeners what is this REX initiative, and maybe the implications of it.
So the REX initiative is actually exactly mounting towards what you said before. What will be the first priorities the Commission should have on their table when they start working, or when they, after the elections, come back to businesses for the next tenure. So, and this is what this REX about. It is basically priorities and recommendations will be formulated for the incoming EU leadership, consisting of the Commission, the European Parliament, Council, but also national authorities. It is about a process that we started already quite some time within ICMPD, where we consulted with our member states, with experts from governmental organizations, but as well from non-governmental organizations, academia. We held discussion rounds to see which should be the priorities the new incoming Commission should take on board as quickly as possible. Now, from there, we go then further and look how they could address these issues, and we do a collection of key themes that the Commission shall explore. There will be Ukraine there. There will be also some thoughts about governance structures, because we also believe that many of the things that are difficult in the migration field at the EU level are because we think very much in so-called policy silos. So we think about legal migration on the one side, irregular migration on the other side, asylum on the other side. But we also think about development completely outside, or our cooperation with external, with third countries, again by another policy silos. Probably also there will be also a priority on labor force, what we just spoke before, because we strongly believe it is not only the right thing to do, but if we not start to be more active, more competitive, if you want to have this word in this contest, on attracting labor migrants also from abroad, this will be hugely costly also for taxpayers, for governments in the EU. So we need to think a bit much more and work much more inclusive in order to come forward. So what you will hopefully see in the time to come, it is on the one side there will be a final product. This should be after summer, should be out, but already before, ICMPD tries to inject some ideas into the policy discussion that are already happening, as we saw the discussion by the letter by the ministers. So all these kind of things we also want to take up and come up with policy briefs or discussion rounds, webinars, in order to put some priorities on some of the issues. So it is called REX. It's recommendations for the incoming EU leadership, and stay tuned to get more information in the weeks to come.
It's an absolutely huge undertaking. Our own member states, who are very often interior ministries, deal very often with ICMPD, but they are talking more and more about labour migration. ICMPD has a really strong lead in our sector on creative labour migration solutions. So it's going to be a really exciting time. And also we're keenly aware of the fact that there's a market demand now for ideas. People want, I think we would always say there's no simple solutions to migration, but there are clever strategies. And that's what our member states are asking of us more and more. And also the European Commission is looking to us more and more as a partner and as a helper in this exercise.
Thank you. So looking forward to seeing the next REX initiative. So as we start to wrap up today's episode, let's take a moment to reflect on the future of the EU migration policies. I think we already addressed quite a lot this topic, maybe to kind of summarize your thoughts on that. So what are both your hopes for how these policies may evolve in the years ahead? How you envision the REX initiative contributing to fostering positive change in this landscape?
For me, I would like to repeat one thing that I said before. I would really like to see the discussion on migration in the political center. I would like that we all take a step back. Especially it will be necessary after the election, because it boils already up again, the whole discussion. And I think it's really, we will not move on if migration is so polarized and whatever worse, sometimes, ideas pop up that are probably less good, but you don't need to bash it. You should sit down, analyze it, and agree or disagree. Yeah? But I think it will be really, really important to develop an atmosphere that you can move on. With the Pact, a first step is done. And I would very much see, you can criticize the Pact, everything, but I would like to see a thrive that goes out of it, that we go jointly together, as we did for 4 million people from Ukraine, providing a safe haven. And I hope that this will be also the possibility in the next Commission tenure.
Yeah, I echo Martin's hopes, and I think that there's a good chance for policy to come back to the centre. The reality is, if you take a step backwards, these Schengen and all of the EU, they're all created 30 years ago at a time of tremendous global optimism and openness. And we didn't really think back then about the control bits because it wasn't so necessary. When I started my career in 2015, more or less, not 2015, 2005, I'm older than that, there were only a few hundred people a year going across the Mediterranean. Now we're extremely grateful. Even in 2020, the year of the pandemic, it was 100,000. We're extremely grateful if it stays at 100,000 every year because that's manageable in our minds. So I think it was necessary to come up with a policy, which we've been arguing for the last 10 years about how to control this. And it was hard for the Europeans. Europe is a project based on openness, not about telling people to go away, telling people to, it's about attraction. And they call it the transformative power of EU enlargement. But the EU can't enlarge across the whole world is the issue. And we all know that the world is not as nice a place now as it was in the 90s. There's geopolitical conflict. There's war on our borders. There's climate change. There's, it's a tougher time than when I grew up anyway, sorry to say. So I think that this was a difficult discussion in the EU. It is now being politically decided. And I think if it's effective, there's every possibility for the conversation to come back into the centre, to be more positive and open about migration, because people will have a sense that the Europeans at least have it under some control, that we don't just have an open borders policy, but neither do we turn away people who are in genuine need of protection. So to my mind, there's a reason to be optimistic, simply because we need people. We are going to be out there looking for people, trying to get millions of people into the EU. And to do that, we have to have a system that functions. So what Martin and I are absolutely united on is we're so glad they've stopped talking about it. And now we're into a just do it phase. Let's try. And there's no failure. Some things won't work, but at least they're trying. They're doing things. And that for me is the most positive takeaway, that we're going to spend the next couple of years actually doing things rather than arguing about the how.
Thank you both for joining us today on this episode. I think it was a very exciting conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise, and looking forward to the REX initiative and discussing it also on this space. Thank you. Today was joining me Hugo Brady, Senior Strategic Advisor at ICMPD, and Martin Wagner, Principal Advisor at ICMPD. I am Paulina Godinez, and we look forward to the next episode of the Migration Podcast by ICMPD. For more insights and expert talks on migration, subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.